Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. What does it feel like to stand at the edge of the known world and still find it not enough? To have conquered every army, crossed every mountain range, and bent every king to your will, only to weep because there are no more worlds left to take? Tonight we follow the life of a man who asked that question and meant it literally. Settle in, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, pull the blanket a little closer, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's begin. A world before Alexander, the stage is set, every story has a stage. And the stage on which Alexander the Great performed his extraordinary, bewildering, sometimes terrifying life was one of the most complicated arrangements of power, culture, and tension that the ancient world had ever produced. To understand what Alexander did, you first have to understand the world he walked into. Because it was not an empty stage waiting for a hero. It was a crowded, noisy, deeply contested place, full of empires and city-states and old grudges and new ambitions. And into the middle of all of it walked a 20-year-old from a kingdom that most of the world considered barely worth mentioning. Let us begin in Persia, because Persia is where everything Alexander did either pointed toward or grew out of, and it is impossible to make sense of his story without it. The Persian Empire in the 4th century before the Common Era was the largest political entity the world had ever seen. It stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west to the borders of modern-day India in the east, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the sands of Egypt and the margins of Ethiopia in the south. If you tried to walk across it, and some people did, it would take you months. If you tried to govern it, which the Persian kings were constantly attempting to do with varying degrees of success, it required a bureaucracy of staggering complexity, a network of roads, relay stations, and provincial governors called satraps, who reported to the king and administered their regions with a combination of local custom and Persian authority. The Persian kings called themselves the King of Kings, and this was not empty rhetoric. They genuinely did rule over dozens of other kings, local monarchs and chieftains who had sworn loyalty to the Achaemenid dynasty, and who paid tribute, supplied soldiers, and attended the great festivals at the Persian capital of Persepolis with appropriate expressions of gratitude and submission. The empire was not a monolith. It was a collection of peoples, languages, religions, and traditions held together by Persian administrative genius, the implied threat of Persian military force, and the extraordinary road system that the Persians had built to move armies and information across their vast domain. At the top of this structure sat the great king. By the time Alexander arrived on the scene, that position was occupied by Darius III, a man who had come to power through a combination of court intrigue and the extinction of several rivals, which was fairly standard for Persian royal succession. Darius was not stupid, and he was not a coward, whatever later Greek sources might suggest. He was a capable ruler trying to manage a vast and complicated empire, but he had never faced anything quite like what was coming. Now, while Persia dominated the east, the western edge of the ancient world was occupied by something very different: Greece. And when I say Greece, I want to be careful, because Greece in the 4th century before the Common Era was not a unified country. It was a collection of independent city-states, each with its own government, its own army, its own identity, and its own deep-seated suspicion of every other city-state within a day's march. Athens was a democracy, more or less, and the cultural centre of the Greek world. Sparta was a military oligarchy that had spent centuries perfecting the art of raising soldiers and not much else. Corinth was wealthy and commercial. Thebes had recently emerged as a serious military power under its brilliant general Epaminondas, who had broken Spartan military dominance at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era, and handed Sparta one of the most shocking defeats in its history. These city-states had spent generations fighting each other. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta had lasted nearly 30 years and left both exhausted. Smaller conflicts bubbled up constantly. The Greeks were brilliant at philosophy, architecture, drama, and naval warfare. They were also spectacularly bad at getting along with each other, which is worth keeping in mind, because one of the things Alexander's father Philip achieved was convincing, persuading, and in several cases simply forcing these city-states to cooperate with each other under his leadership. Between Greece and Persia lay the Aegean Sea, which sounds like a comfortable buffer but was actually more like a shared backyard where both sides kept accidentally bumping into each other. The Persian wars of the early 5th century, when Darius I and then Xerxes had invaded Greece and been turned back at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis and Plataea, had left a deep scar on the Greek imagination. The Persians had burned Athens. They had killed 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, though the Spartans had made such a legend of those 300 that the defeat almost seemed like a victory, and the Greeks had pushed them back. Against all odds, against overwhelming numbers, the Greek city-states had held, and the memory of that resistance was something every Greek child grew up knowing. The idea of a revenge expedition against Persia, a great campaign to punish the empire for its invasion, to liberate the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast that still lived under Persian rule, had been floating around Greek intellectual circles for decades. Philosophers and speechwriters had promoted it. The Athenian orator Socrates had spent much of his long life arguing that the Greeks should unite, put aside their differences and march east together. He had written letters to various powerful men suggesting they lead this campaign. He had written to Philip of Macedon. He had high hopes, and then there was Egypt. Ancient, proud, wealthy Egypt, which had been conquered by the Persians and which still resented it. Egypt was perhaps the oldest continuous civilization in the known world, its culture stretching back 3,000 years by the time Alexander was born, its temples and pyramids so ancient that even to an Egyptian of the 4th century they were already antiquities. Egypt had revolted against Persian rule several times. It remained a source of grain, wealth, and symbolism that whoever controlled it gained an enormous political and economic advantage. To the east of Persia, beyond the Iranian plateau, lay the territories that would eventually become Afghanistan and Pakistan, regions of mountains and plateaus and nomadic peoples that had defied easy governance since before anyone was keeping records. And beyond those, the subcontinent of India, which even the Persians had only barely touched, whose wealth was legendary, whose elephants were famous, and whose true extent was unknown to anyone in the Mediterranean world. This was the world in 356 before the Common Era, roughly. A world of empires and city-states and ancient civilizations and unexplored horizons. A world that had never been unified under a single ruler, that had never seen a military force capable of crossing it from end to end. A world that was, whether it knew it or not, about to meet Alexander. But before Alexander, there was Philip. And Philip deserves his own chapter, because without Philip, there is no Alexander. That is not a controversial statement. It is simply true, and it is one of the great ironies of history that the man who made the conquest of the known world possible spent most of his life being overshadowed by the son who carried it out. The making of a king, Philip of Macedon and the kingdom he built. Macedonia, in the early 4th century before the Common Era, was not impressive. I say this with all the affection in the world for the Macedonians, but the historical record is fairly clear on this point. The Greek city-states to the south regarded Macedonia as a semi-barbarous backwater, inhabited by people who drank too much, spoke a rough dialect, wore animal skins, and had not yet mastered the finer points of civilized discourse. The Macedonians, for their part, were perfectly aware of this opinion and mostly did not care, which is perhaps the beginning of their story. Macedonia was a kingdom, not a city-state. It was governed by a king who commanded the loyalty of a nobility of horsemen and landowners, the companions, who feasted with the king, fought beside him, and expected to be consulted on major decisions. The peasant farmers and mountain clans that made up the rest of Macedonian society owed loyalty to these nobles and through them to the king. It was a feudal arrangement, older and rougher than the civic institutions of Athens or Corinth, and it had the significant advantage of producing men who were accustomed to hardship and to warfare. But Macedonia was also weak. When Philip II came to power in 359, the kingdom was in crisis. His brother Perdiccas III had just been killed in battle against the Illyrians along the northwestern frontier. The Macedonian army had been badly mauled. Multiple claimants to the throne were being supported by various neighbouring powers, each hoping to install a puppet in Pella, the Macedonian capital. Thrace was a problem to the east. Athens was meddling to the south. The Illyrians were raiding from the north. Macedonia was surrounded and outmatched, and Philip was 23 years old and had almost nothing to work with. What Philip did in the years that followed was nothing short of remarkable. He began by doing something very smart, which was buying time. He made peace with the Illyrians. He neutralized the rival claimants to his throne, some diplomatically and some not. He turned his attention to the army. and it was here that Philip's genius expressed itself most clearly. The Greek world had been dominated for generations by the hoplite, a heavily armoured infantryman who fought in a tight formation called the phalanx, shield overlapping shield, spears bristling forward. The phalanx was formidable when fighting on flat ground against other hoplites. It was less flexible in other circumstances. Philip took the basic concept of the phalanx and transformed it. He gave his infantrymen longer spears, the sarissa, a pike that measured somewhere between 15 and 21 feet in length, so long that it had to be held in both hands. The front ranks of his phalanx levelled their sarissas forward, and the men behind them held theirs at angles over their predecessors' shoulders, creating a wall of overlapping points that no enemy could penetrate from the front. The sarissa phalanx was extraordinarily effective, and it became the core of the Macedonian military system. But Philip understood something that many commanders did not. The phalanx was a hammer, but a hammer is only useful if you can hold the nail in place. The companion cavalry, the noble horsemen who had always ridden beside Macedonian kings, became the other half of Philip's military equation. The cavalry would find the weak point in an enemy line, drive through it, and collapse the enemy formation from behind while the phalanx ground forward from the front. It was not a revolutionary concept in theory, but Philip drilled it to perfection. He trained his army constantly. He moved it fast, covering distances that seemed impossible to enemies who were used to thinking of armies as slow, cumbersome things that needed supply wagons and weeks of preparation. Philip also married strategically, several times. Philip had, if I am being honest, a rather extraordinary number of wives, which was accepted Macedonian practice for a king who needed to cement alliances in multiple directions simultaneously. His marriages brought him connections to Epirus, Thessaly, and other neighbouring regions. One of these marriages, to a princess of Epirus named Olympias, would produce a son named Alexander. We will get to Olympias shortly, and she deserves considerable attention, because she was by all accounts one of the most formidable women in the ancient world, which is saying something in a century that produced several remarkable women. Through a combination of military prowess, diplomatic cunning, and a willingness to offer people money when violence seemed counterproductive, Philip expanded Macedonian power steadily southward through the 340s. He captured the gold mines of Amphipolis and Cranides, renaming the latter Philippi after himself, which gave him the financial resources to pay for everything else. He moved into Thessaly, gaining access to its excellent cavalry and its grain-producing plains. He intervened in the sacred wars that were disrupting the Greek world and emerged from them with a seat on the Amphictyonic Council, the body that governed the great shrine at Delphi, giving him a degree of legitimacy within Greek religious and political life that no previous Macedonian king had possessed. The Greek city-states watched all of this with growing alarm and remarkable disunity. Athens in particular was deeply concerned. The great orator Demosthenes delivered a series of speeches warning Athens about Philip's ambitions, speeches so famous that hostile rhetoric of any kind is still sometimes called a Philippic today, but the Athenians could not quite bring themselves to act effectively. They made alliances, then broke them. They sent forces, then recalled them. They worried, and then they argued, and then they worried some more. Philip meanwhile just kept advancing. The end came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 before the Common Era. Philip had moved into central Greece with his army, and the Greek city-states, Athens and Thebes most prominently, finally put aside enough of their differences to field a combined force against him. They met on the plain of Chaeronea in Boeotia, and what followed was a masterclass in Macedonian combined arms tactics. Philip commanded the right wing of his army personally. The left wing was given to his 18-year-old son Alexander, who was leading the companion cavalry. Philip's right advanced, appeared to give ground, drew the Athenians forward and out of formation, and then the cavalry on the left under Alexander smashed through the gap that had opened in the Greek line. The sacred band of Thebes, the elite fighting force that had never been broken in battle, was destroyed almost to the last man. Greece was conquered, or perhaps more accurately, Greece was persuaded, because Philip was subtle enough to know that occupying Greek cities with Macedonian garrisons would create endless problems. Instead, he arranged the League of Corinth, a coalition of Greek states, Sparta pointedly excluded, that agreed to follow Philip's leadership in a campaign of revenge against Persia. The old idea that Isocrates and others had floated for decades was now going to happen. Philip would lead a Greek crusade against the empire that had burned Athens. It was a masterpiece of political framing. Philip sent an advance force into Asia Minor in 336. He was planning a great campaign. He had unified Greece, built the finest army in the known world, secured his borders, and arranged a grand coalition. He was at the height of his power, and then he was murdered. At his daughter's wedding celebration, Philip II of Macedon was stabbed to death by one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, whose motives remain disputed to this day. Some ancient sources suggest a personal grievance. Others hint at conspiracy involving Philip's other wives or sons. Alexander's mother Olympias has been suspected. Alexander himself has been suspected, though the evidence for any organised conspiracy is thin. The killer was caught and killed immediately, which means the truth of what he knew or who sent him died with him. Philip was 46 years old. He had taken a kingdom on the edge of collapse and turned it into the dominant power in the Greek world. He had built the army that would conquer Persia. He had conceived and planned the campaign that would make Alexander immortal, and he never got to lead it. His son was 20 years old, and he was watching, born to thunder. Alexander's childhood and early years. The ancient world loved a good birth omen. The greater the figure, the more elaborate the signs that supposedly attended their arrival. And Alexander the Great, perhaps unsurprisingly, came with a full set. He was born in July of 356 before the Common Era in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. His mother was Olympias, a princess of the Molossian royal house of Epirus, a region to the west of Macedonia, whose people were considered only marginally more civilized than the Macedonians themselves by Greek standards. Olympias was intense. This is the diplomatic way of putting it. She was passionate, religious, fiercely protective of her son, and by multiple ancient accounts deeply devoted to the mystery cults of Dionysus, to the point where she kept sacred snakes in her bedroom, which is the kind of detail that makes you understand why Philip spent a lot of time on campaign. On the night Alexander was born, the ancient sources tell us that the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. The explanation offered at the time was that the goddess had been away from her temple attending to Alexander's birth. This is very flattering, and also the kind of story that circulates after a man becomes famous rather than before. There were also reports that Philip, returning from a victorious campaign, received on the same day the news of Alexander's birth, a victory by his horses at the Olympic Games, and word that one of his generals had won a battle. 3 pieces of good news in a single day. The omens were hard to miss. Philip reportedly consulted the oracle at Delphi about his son and was told that the boy was unconquerable. He also reportedly worried about this, because a son who is unconquerable is not necessarily an easy son to manage, and Philip had enough problems already. Olympias told Alexander from childhood that his real father was not Philip but Zeus himself, in the form of a serpent, which is not the sort of thing you say to a child if you want him to grow up with a modest opinion of his own importance. Alexander received this information with what appears to have been complete seriousness. Whether he believed it literally or understood it as a symbolic claim to divine favour depends on which ancient source you consult and on how charitable you are feeling about the intersection of royal ambition and personal mythology. What is clear is that he never denied it, and that it coloured his understanding of himself for his entire life. Philip seems to have been a complicated father. He was present enough to take an interest in Alexander's education, and to bring him along on campaign when the boy was old enough, but absent enough that the relationship between mother and son was exceptionally close, and the relationship between father and son was complicated by rivalry, by Philip's other marriages, and eventually by a rupture so serious that Alexander and Olympias briefly went into exile together. For all the admiration Alexander had for his father's achievements, which was genuine, there was also something competitive running beneath it, something that expressed itself in the famous story that, when Philip kept winning battles and victories, young Alexander would turn to his companions and say that his father was going to leave nothing great for him to accomplish. That is the sort of thing a child says when they already know, in their bones, what they are going to be. The physical descriptions of Alexander that survive are fascinating precisely because they do not sound like what you might expect of a conqueror. He was not particularly tall. He was perhaps 5 feet tall, which was average for a Macedonian man of his time, though the Persians were reportedly startled by how short he was when they finally met him. He had a powerful build, a slightly tilted neck that gave him a characteristic head angle that became famous enough that his sculptors always reproduced it. His eyes were described as mismatched, one eye lighter than the other. His skin was fair, he tended to flush in the face when emotional, and his hair was reportedly lion-coloured. a reddish or tawny golden shade that he wore swept back from his forehead. He was also, from a very early age, exceptional, not just in the way that parents say their child is exceptional, but observably, demonstrably exceptional. He learned quickly, he retained what he learned, he asked questions that surprised his tutors, and he had a quality that people struggled to describe but consistently noticed. A kind of magnetism, a presence that made people want to follow him. The horse story is the best illustration of this. Alexander was about 12 when Philip was considering buying a horse named Bucephalus, a large, beautiful, dark animal with a white star on his forehead. The horse was wild. It was refusing to allow anyone to mount it, rearing and spinning and generally making itself impossible. The horse traders had brought it hoping Philip would buy it, but the animal was behaving so badly that Philip was about to send it away. Alexander watched this and said something like, "What a horse they are losing because they do not know how to handle it." Philip, apparently amused, challenged his son to do better. Alexander had noticed what the adults had missed. The horse was shying at its own shadow. Alexander turned Bucephalus to face the sun, walked beside it quietly until it calmed, then leaped onto its back. Bucephalus ran, and the assembled Macedonian nobility watched the boy ride the animal at full gallop and bring it back to his father. Philip, according to Plutarch, was moved to tears and said, "My son, you will have to find a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small. This is probably polished by centuries of retelling. But the core of it rings true. The boy who watched what everyone else missed, acted when everyone else hesitated, and solved with patience and observation the problem that force had failed to solve, that boy was very recognizably the man who would later command armies." Bucephalus carried Alexander across Asia for the next 20 years. When the horse finally died in India at the age of approximately 30, which is very old for a warhorse, and speaks to the extraordinary care Alexander gave him, Alexander founded a city on the site and named it Bucephala in the horse's honour. This is, I think, rather sweet, and I will not apologise for saying so. The Education of a Conqueror, Aristotle and the Years of Formation. In 343 before the Common Era, Philip of Macedon sent a letter to Aristotle of Stagira. The letter, preserved in later sources, contains one of the most famous sentences any father has ever written about a son. Philip wrote that he was grateful that his son had been born in the same time as Aristotle, because he hoped the philosopher would train the boy and make him worthy of the kingdom he would inherit. This is, on one level, a piece of royal flattery. Philip knew how to manage people and he knew that philosophers like to feel important. But it was also completely sincere, because Philip understood better than anyone that the kingdom he was building could not be held by a man who only knew how to fight. To govern what he was creating, to manage the coalition of Greek states, to lead a campaign against Persia, required a different kind of intelligence. It required the ability to think, to adapt, to understand the world in its complexity, rather than simply imposing one's will upon it. Aristotle was at this point perhaps 41 years old, and was already one of the most formidable intellects the world had produced. He had spent 2 decades in Plato's academy in Athens. He had conducted biological research in the Aegean. He had studied rhetoric, logic, ethics, politics, poetry, physics, and metaphysics, not as separate disciplines but as interconnected aspects of a comprehensive understanding of the world. He was, in the most literal sense, trying to understand everything. Philip offered him a deal. "Come to Macedonia, teach my son." In return, Philip would rebuild the town of Stagira, Aristotle's birthplace, which the Macedonians had previously destroyed, and restore the Stagiran exiles to their homes. It was a remarkable offer. It suggested that Philip understood what Aristotle was worth, and it suggested that he was willing to pay for it properly. Aristotle came. He and Alexander spent approximately 3 years together at a place called Mieza, a quiet garden setting away from the court, where the philosopher taught the prince. And while we do not have a complete curriculum, the fragments that survive give us a picture of what those years contained. Aristotle taught Alexander philosophy, which meant above all else the importance of reason, of examining questions carefully, of not accepting easy answers. He taught him rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively, which Alexander would use throughout his life to manage his army and his court. He taught him medicine to a level of competence unusual for a non-physician. Alexander's surviving letters show him discussing medical treatments with some sophistication, and multiple ancient sources note that he was in the habit of recommending remedies to sick friends. Aristotle also taught him Homer. This is the one that matters most. Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The great epics that sat at the centre of Greek literary and cultural life that every educated Greek knew by heart, that described a world of heroes and gods and extraordinary deeds and the terrible cost that greatness exacts. Alexander did not just read Homer, he breathed Homer. He slept with a copy of the Iliad that Aristotle had annotated tucked under his pillow beside his dagger, and he carried it with him across Asia. His model, his ideal, the standard against which he measured himself throughout his life, was Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes, swift, ferocious, magnificent, and doomed. The choice of Achilles as a personal ideal tells you something important about Alexander. Achilles in the Iliad is offered a choice between a long, quiet life without glory and a short, brilliant life that will be remembered forever. He chooses the second without hesitation. Alexander made the same choice, though I'm not sure he framed it quite so consciously. It was simply the way he was built. The idea of a long, quiet life held no attraction for him whatsoever. He wanted greatness, and he was willing to pay whatever price it required, which would turn out to be rather more than even he anticipated. Aristotle also apparently tried to give Alexander a respect for other cultures, particularly the Persians. That was unusual for a Greek of his time. This had mixed results. Alexander showed remarkable respect for conquered peoples throughout much of his campaign, adopting Persian customs and treating Persian aristocracy with a courtesy that infuriated some of his Macedonian companions. But he also burned Persepolis, which Aristotle would probably not have approved of. Philosophy and the heat of the moment do not always agree with each other. The relationship between teacher and student did not survive Alexander's kingship entirely intact. Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes travelled with the army as an official historian and eventually fell out with Alexander over the question of divine worship, which we will come to later, and was arrested and died in custody. Aristotle himself is said to have written to Alexander expressing his unhappiness at this. Alexander's response was not conciliatory. The warmth of the Mesa years had given way to the distance between a philosopher in Athens and a king who no longer needed anyone's approval. But the years at Mesa left marks. Alexander's curiosity was genuine and lifelong. He sent botanical and biological specimens back to Aristotle from the territories he conquered. He was interested in the cultures he encountered, in the religions and customs and histories of the peoples who became his subjects. He ordered fish to be brought to him alive from the Indian Ocean because he had never seen that particular species. He asked questions. He read. He thought. The years under Aristotle made him something more than a soldier, and the world of his conquest was shaped by that broader education in ways that pure military genius alone could never have produced. One more thing about Aristotle that bears mentioning. He reportedly told Alexander that he should treat the Greeks as friends and the barbarians, by which he meant non-Greeks, as slaves or animals. Alexander ignored this advice almost entirely, which is somewhat extraordinary given how thoroughly he absorbed everything else Aristotle taught him. He came to believe, or at least to act as though he believed, that all peoples had worth, that Persians and Egyptians and Bactrians could serve in his court and his army, and could marry into Macedonian families. This idea was so radical for his time that it alienated many of his own men. Whether it was genuine philosophy or political calculation is one of the great questions about Alexander's character, and I will leave you to form your own opinion as we go. The throne runs read: Philip's assassination and Alexander's seizure of power. The wedding of Philip's daughter Cleopatra, named after the Macedonian tradition rather than the more famous Egyptian, was supposed to be a celebration. Philip was at the height of his power in 336 before the Common Era. Macedonia dominated Greece. The advance force he had sent into Asia Minor was already operating beyond the Hellespont. He was about to embark on the great campaign against Persia that he had spent years preparing. The wedding was a festival, a statement of confidence, a public display of Macedonian prosperity and power. There were guests from across the Greek world. There were athletic contests and feasts and theatrical performances. Philip was in an expansive mood. He had arranged for the ceremony to include a procession of statues of the 12 Olympian gods, and had added a 13th statue, his own, walking among the gods. This was bold even by Macedonian standards, and it tells you something about where Philip's sense of himself had arrived by this point. He was not quite claiming divinity, but he was not claiming it either. On the morning of the wedding ceremony, Philip walked through the theatre at Aegae with only a light bodyguard, because he had insisted on appearing approachable and accessible, a gesture of confidence in his own security. It was a mistake. One of his bodyguards, a young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias, stepped forward and drove a dagger into his side. Philip fell. He died almost immediately. Pausanias ran. He nearly made it to horses waiting at the edge of the city, which suggests the escape had been planned. He was caught by other bodyguards and killed before he could be questioned. The man who organised the waiting horses was never definitively identified. The truth of what happened at Aegi died with Pausanias on the road. What happened in the hours and days that followed is a masterclass in how to seize power, in a world where power is determined by speed, decisiveness, and the willingness to do what needs to be done before your opponents can react. Alexander was 20 years old. He had the support of several key Macedonian nobles who had been his companions, and he had the loyalty of the army, or at least enough of the army to make the alternative unattractive. He moved immediately. Other claimants to the Macedonian throne, half-brothers and cousins and distant relatives who might have served as rallying points for rivals, were eliminated. Some were executed outright. Some were killed in circumstances that the historical record describes with varying degrees of diplomatic vagueness. The ancient sources are fairly clear that Olympias was involved in some of this. Philip's most recent wife, Cleopatra, a different Cleopatra from the daughter, an actual Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, and her infant child by Philip were killed. The ancient sources attribute this to Olympias rather than Alexander, and whether Alexander approved, ordered, or simply looked away is one of those questions that the evidence does not quite answer. What is clear is that it happened, and that it served Alexander's interests. Within days, Alexander had secured the throne. He summoned the Macedonian assembly, presented himself as Philip's legitimate heir, and was acclaimed king. He was generous to the Macedonians, remitting certain taxes and obligations, making his accession feel like a fresh start. He then began dealing with the external situation, which was complicated. Philip's death had sent a wave of excitement through the Greek city-states. Several of them had interpreted his murder as an opportunity. Demosthenes, who had spent years warning Athens about Philip, appeared in public wearing a garland as though celebrating. Thebes began to stir. Athens debated what to do. Various pretenders to the Macedonian throne were encouraged by neighbours who saw instability as their chance. To the north, Illyrian and Thracian tribes began testing the borders that Philip had spent years establishing. Alexander's response to all of this was to move so fast that his opponents never had time to coordinate. He marched north first, subduing the Thracian tribes in a campaign of such speed and efficiency that it seemed almost casual. Then he turned west and dealt with the Illyrians. Then he turned south toward Greece. The Greek city-states had been expecting a teenager, or at least a young man still finding his footing, someone they could manage. What they got instead was Philip's army, commanded by someone who had apparently inherited not only his father's military genius, but his strategic clarity and his willingness to act without hesitation. Alexander moved south with his army so quickly that the Greek cities scarcely had time to react before he was among them. At Corinth, the league that Philip had created was reconstituted under Alexander. The Greek states, with the exception of Sparta, which remained outside and irritable, confirmed Alexander as hegemon, leader, of the campaign against Persia. He was now, officially and publicly, the successor to his father's grand design. There is a famous story set at this period that may or may not be exactly historically accurate, but which is far too good to omit. Alexander visited Corinth and learned that the philosopher Diogenes was living there. Diogenes was a cynic, a philosopher who rejected conventional society and lived in the most deliberately simple way possible, reportedly in a large ceramic pot or barrel, and was famous for saying exactly what he thought to anyone, regardless of their status or power. Alexander went to visit him, curious to meet this famous figure. He found Diogenes lying in the sun. He approached and introduced himself as Alexander, King of Macedon. Diogenes looked up. Alexander said that he could give Diogenes anything he wanted, anything at all, and asked what Diogenes desired. Diogenes said that he would like Alexander to step aside because he was blocking the sun. Alexander, by all accounts, was not offended. He turned to his companions and said that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. The story, whether precisely true or not, captures something real about Alexander. He genuinely admired independence of spirit. He did not always tolerate it in practice, but he admired it, and the fact that he found Diogenes' response funny rather than insulting says something about the range of his character. But there was still serious business ahead, because while Alexander was managing the Greeks and securing his northern borders, a city in Greece was making a decision that would demonstrate to everyone exactly what kind of king Alexander was going to be. Greece bends the knee. The destruction of Thebes and the League of Corinth. Thebes revolted. This requires some explanation. Thebes was one of the most powerful city-states in Greece. Its sacred band, the elite fighting force of 300 paired warriors who had famously been destroyed at Chæronea, had been the embodiment of Greek military excellence for a generation. The city had a proud history, a formidable tradition of resistance to outside authority, and apparently a significant problem with accurately assessing situations. In 335 before the Common Era, while Alexander was campaigning in Thrace, a rumour spread through Greece that he had been killed. We do not know where the rumour started. We know that Demosthenes in Athens encouraged it, that he produced a man who claimed to have witnessed Alexander's death with his own eyes, and that the story spread fast enough and was believed widely enough that Thebes decided to act on it. The Thebans expelled the Macedonian garrison that had been stationed in the city, murdered some of the Macedonian soldiers, and declared their independence from the League of Corinth. Other cities began to stir. It looked for a moment like the whole Macedonian arrangement in Greece might unravel, and then Alexander arrived. He was not dead. He had marched his army from Thrace to the outskirts of Thebes in approximately 2 weeks, covering distances that seemed physically impossible for an army of that size. His enemies had been expecting months of warning. They got days. There is a pattern here that we will see again and again in Alexander's campaigns. Speed was a weapon. The enemy's assumptions about what was possible were always working against them. Alexander arrived outside Thebes and offered terms. He gave the city a chance to surrender peacefully. The Thebans refused. They were committed now, and they had sent appeals to other Greek cities for help. Those appeals got very little response, because by the time they arrived, Alexander's army was already at the gates. The siege was brief. One of Alexander's generals found an unguarded gate and forced his way into the city before the main assault. What followed was the destruction of Thebes. The city was razed to the ground. The population was enslaved or sold. 6,000 Thebans were killed in the fighting. The houses and the temples came down. The streets were pulled apart. Thebes, one of the oldest and most storied cities in Greece, ceased to exist. Alexander made 2 exceptions. The temples of the gods were not to be touched, which reflected a consistent principle in his treatment of conquered places. And the house of the poet Pindar was to be preserved, because Pindar had written verses praising Macedonia, and Alexander admired his poetry. This is one of the more remarkable details of the Theban destruction. An entire city eliminated and one house left standing because the king liked the owner's poems. It is either a beautiful gesture toward culture or a deeply unnerving illustration of how completely arbitrary the line between destruction and survival was in Alexander's world. Probably both. The message to Greece was received with absolute clarity. Within weeks, Athens sent ambassadors offering submission and congratulations. Demosthenes, who had been wearing that garland when Philip died, now stayed very quiet. Every city that had been considering following Thebes' example reconsidered with great urgency. Greece was not going to revolt. Not now, not while this young man was alive and moving. There is a story that Alexander himself felt complicated about what he had done at Thebes. Plutarch says that later in his life, when things went wrong, or when he committed acts he regretted, he sometimes attributed his misfortunes to divine punishment for the destruction of the city. Whether this is true introspection or retrospective narrative construction by later writers is hard to say. But it suggests that even Alexander, who could be extraordinarily ruthless when he felt it necessary, was not entirely comfortable with the extremes that his ruthlessness could reach. What Thebes accomplished, paradoxically, was to secure Alexander's rear before the Great Eastern Campaign. With Greece subdued, with the League of Corinth firmly under Macedonian leadership, with no credible challenger remaining in the Greek world, Alexander could turn east. He could cross the Hellespont and begin the campaign that his father had planned and that he had been preparing for his entire conscious life. In the spring of 334 before the Common Era, Alexander gathered his army at Pella and marched to the Hellespont. The force was smaller than you might expect for a campaign of this ambition, approximately 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. They were crossing into Persian-controlled territory to take on an empire of millions, commanded by a great king who could field armies that dwarfed the Macedonian force several times over. Several of his senior advisors suggested caution. One of them, the experienced General Parmenion, recommended that Alexander marry and produce an heir before embarking on such a dangerous campaign, so that Macedonia would not be left without a successor if things went badly. Alexander's response was that it would be a disgrace to delay for such reasons. He had a kingdom to win. Crossing into legend, the invasion of Persia begins. The crossing of the Hellespont in 334 before the Common Era was not just a military maneuver, it was a statement, it was a performance. Alexander understood, better than almost anyone else, the power of symbolic action, and he staged the crossing with this understanding clearly in mind. As the fleet of transport ships carried his army across the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, Alexander himself steered the royal trireme toward the Asian shore. In the middle of the crossing, he poured a libation into the sea from a golden cup and prayed to Poseidon. When the prow touched the Asian shore, Alexander was the first to leap out. He was wearing armor. He carried a spear. He threw the spear into the Asian soil and declared that he accepted Asia as a spear-won land from the gods. The symbolism was multiple and deliberate. The thrown spear claimed the continent. It echoed the language of Homeric heroism, where land is won by the spear rather than by treaty. It announced that this was conquest, not negotiation, and it placed Alexander in the tradition of the great heroes of legend who had also come to Asia, because after the crossing, Alexander did something that was entirely expected of him, and that he had clearly been anticipating for years. He went to Troy, or rather, to the place that was believed, in the 4th century before the Common Era, to be the site of Troy. He went to Ilium, as it was then called, and he performed at the tomb of Achilles. He ran a race around the tomb, naked and anointed with oil, in the tradition of the funeral games. He made offerings. He declared Achilles fortunate for having had Homer to celebrate his glory. His companion Hephaestion made offerings at the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' closest friend, a detail that was certainly noted by everyone present, and that speaks to the nature of their relationship in terms that the ancient world would have understood clearly. The visit to Troy was not a digression. It was essential. Alexander was casting himself in a role, stepping into a story that every Greek knew by heart, positioning himself as the new Achilles setting out on a greater campaign than the original. If you wanted to understand why men would follow him to the edge of the world and beyond, the visit to Troy is part of the answer. He gave them a narrative. He made their lives feel mythological. He told them they were not just soldiers on campaign, they were characters in the greatest story that had ever been told. And then the practical business of conquest began. The Persian satraps, the regional governors of Anatolia, had gathered an army to meet the Macedonian invasion. They had advice from a Greek mercenary commander named Memnon of Rhodes, who recommended a scorched earth strategy, burning the countryside to deny the invaders supplies, and avoiding a pitched battle where the Macedonians would have an advantage. This was actually sound strategic thinking. If the Persians had followed it, Alexander's campaign might have stalled very quickly. They did not follow it. The Persian nobility considered it dishonourable to retreat before an enemy without fighting, and they did not trust Memnon, who was Greek and therefore suspect. They chose to fight. The two forces met at the Granicus River in May of 334. The Granicus was not a small stream. It was a river with steep, crumbling banks, and the Persians had positioned their cavalry along the far bank with the intention of cutting down the Macedonians as they struggled across the current. The defensive position was good. Several of Alexander's generals, including Parmenion, suggested waiting until dawn the next day, when they might find a better crossing point. Alexander refused. He attacked immediately in the afternoon, and he led the charge himself. What followed was extremely dangerous. The Macedonian cavalry plunged into the river under Persian missile fire, scrambled up the far bank against cavalry that had the advantage of higher ground, and fought a melee that could have gone either way. Alexander was in the thick of it. He was conspicuous by design, wearing a white-plumed helmet that made him visible across the battlefield because he believed that a commander who led from the front inspired his men in ways that a commander who directed from the rear never could. This was correct. It also meant that he was a very obvious target. He nearly died at the Granicus. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates came up behind him and swung a battle-axe at Alexander's head. The blow was partially deflected by Alexander's helmet but opened a wound in his scalp. Before Spithridates could deliver a killing blow, Alexander's companion Cletus, nicknamed Cletus the Black, drove a spear through the Persian's arm, severing it. Alexander survived because his friend was quick. We will come back to Cletus later. That kindness at the Granicus was repaid, years afterward, in the worst possible way. The Macedonians won the Battle of the Granicus. The Persian cavalry broke and fled. The Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were surrounded and most of them killed. Alexander reportedly offered them quarter at first, but when they refused to surrender and demanded to be allowed to march away freely, he refused and they were slaughtered or enslaved. This was harsh, and it was intentional. Alexander needed to make it clear that fighting for Persia against Greece was a choice that carried severe consequences. After Granicus, Alexander moved through Anatolia. City after city opened its gates, either out of genuine relief at being freed from Persian control, or out of realistic assessment of what happened to places that resisted. He liberated the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast, removed the oligarchies that the Persians had typically supported, and established democracies, which was politically astute since democratic factions tended to be pro-Macedonian, while oligarchs had usually been the Persian collaborators. He also did something that revealed his logistical intelligence. He disbanded his own fleet. This seems counterintuitive, but was actually brilliant. Alexander did not have the resources to maintain a large fleet and a large army simultaneously, and without Persian ports the Persian navy would have nowhere to operate. So rather than splitting his resources, he decided to conquer the Persian navy's bases from land, one by one, until the navy had nowhere left to go. It was a genuinely creative solution to a difficult strategic problem. He moved south through Lydia, capturing Sardis, the regional capital, which opened its gates to him. He moved into Lycia and Pamphylia, the southern coast of what is now Turkey, accepting the surrender of coastal cities and making examples of those that tried to resist. He was building momentum, accumulating territory, and doing it with a speed that kept his opponents perpetually off balance. Ahead of him lay the Gordian Knot, and beyond that, the heart of the Persian Empire, and Darius himself. The Gordian Knot and the road south, Anatolia falls. There is a story about Alexander and a knot that has become one of the most famous anecdotes in all of history, and like many famous anecdotes, it has been polished and simplified by centuries of retelling until the rough edges are gone. But the core of it is worth examining both for what it actually says and for what it has been made to mean. At Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia in central Anatolia, there was a wagon tied to a post with a knot of cornel bark that was supposedly so intricate, so tightly wound, so completely without visible ends or beginning, that no one had ever been able to undo it. The local tradition held that whoever managed to untie the Gordian knot would become ruler of all Asia. It had been there for generations, tied by Gordius, the legendary founder of the Phrygian dynasty, and it had resisted every attempt to solve it. Alexander came to Gordium in 333 and examined the knot. He thought about it for a while. Then, according to some sources, he drew his sword and cut through it. According to other sources, he pulled out the pin that held the yoke to the wagon pole, which had the effect of allowing the loops of the knot to fall free without technically cutting anything. His companions proclaimed this a valid solution to the challenge. The omen was taken as favourable. Alexander would indeed rule Asia. Now, the honest truth is that we do not know exactly what he did. The two versions suggest that the story was already contested in antiquity, and the cutting version, which is the one everyone remembers, has become a metaphor for bold, unconventional problem-solving to such an extent that the phrase, "cut the Gordian knot," has entered the language in most European tongues. Whether Alexander cut it or cleverly pulled the pin is, in one sense, beside the point. The point is that he encountered a problem that everyone had decided was impossible, and he decided that the impossibility was itself the thing that needed to be questioned. From Gordium he moved south and then east, because the campaign required him to confront the Persian military seriously. The satraps of Anatolia had been defeated at the Granicus, but Darius the Great King had not yet entered the field personally. Persian resistance in Anatolia was being led by Memnon of Rhodes, the same Greek mercenary who had previously advised against a pitched battle, and Memnon was actually quite effective. He was using the Persian navy to threaten the Macedonian rear, attacking the Aegean islands and threatening to carry the war back to Greece itself. Then Memnon died of illness in 333, which was a substantial stroke of luck for Alexander. The Persian naval strategy lost its best commander, and while the threat did not vanish entirely, it diminished. Meanwhile, Alexander had a medical crisis of his own. Marching south through Cilicia, he stopped to bathe in a cold mountain river and developed a severe fever almost immediately. His doctors were alarmed. His condition deteriorated quickly. A physician named Philip of Acarnania, who had treated Alexander since childhood, proposed a risky treatment involving a strong purgative medicine. While Philip was preparing the medicine, Alexander received a letter from Parmenion, his senior general. warning him that Philip of Acarnania had been bribed by Darius to poison him. The letter was specific and alarming. It looked credible. Alexander read the letter, folded it, and placed it under his pillow without showing it to anyone. When Philip the physician arrived with the medicine, Alexander took the cup, drank it, and then handed Philip the letter to read. He watched the doctor's face as he read, and Philip's obvious shock and distress apparently confirmed Alexander's trust in him. The medicine worked. Alexander recovered. Whether Parmenion's warning was based on real intelligence or was simply someone trying to sow distrust around the king is unknown. What the story reveals is Alexander's characteristic combination of courage and psychological acuity. He could have refused the medicine. He chose instead to test his doctor and trust him simultaneously. He was back in the field within days, and Darius was waiting. The great king had finally decided to take the field personally. He had assembled an enormous army, the size of which ancient sources dramatically overstate, but which was certainly vastly larger than Alexander's force. He was moving to intercept the Macedonians before they could penetrate further into Persian territory. The two armies were moving toward each other through the mountains and narrow coastal plains of what is now southern Turkey and northern Syria, and through a combination of bad communications and poor intelligence on both sides, they managed to pass each other in parallel, so that for a brief, extraordinary moment, Darius's army was actually behind Alexander, and Alexander's army was actually ahead of Darius. When Alexander discovered this, he turned around. The two armies met on the coastal plain near a town called Issus. Issus, the first great clash with Darius III. The plain of Issus was not a good place for Darius's army to fight. It was narrow, hemmed in by the sea on one side and mountains on the other, which meant that the Persian numerical advantage was substantially reduced. Darius had perhaps 200,000 men, though this figure from ancient sources is almost certainly an exaggeration. Alexander had perhaps 40,000. On a narrow plain, the difference in numbers meant much less than it would in open country. Darius had positioned his army with the Pinarus River between the two forces. He placed his Greek mercenaries in the centre of his infantry line, where they would face the Macedonian phalanx, because he correctly identified the Greek mercenaries as his best foot soldiers. On the wings, he deployed cavalry, and on the left wing, the hillside that rose from the plain, he positioned infantry to prevent Alexander from using the high ground. Alexander examined the battlefield and made his plan. He would lead the companion cavalry on the right wing. He would advance at an angle toward the point where the Persian left met the Pinarus River, looking for the gap between the mercenaries and the cavalry. Parmenion would hold the left wing near the sea and prevent the Persian cavalry there from rolling around the Macedonian flank. The phalanx would advance in the centre. The battle began, and almost immediately it went wrong on several fronts simultaneously. On the left, the Persian cavalry was aggressive and powerful, and Parmenion's wing was under serious pressure. In the centre, the Macedonian phalanx advanced, but the terrain around the river caused the line to break unevenly, and the Greek mercenaries on the Persian side drove into the gap, cutting into the Macedonian infantry. The battle was genuinely in the balance for a period that must have felt endless to the men fighting it. And then Alexander found the gap. On the right wing, he drove the companion cavalry across the Pinarus River, broke through the junction between the Persian cavalry and the Greek mercenaries, and turned inward. He was now driving directly toward Darius, who stood in his chariot in the centre of the Persian line, surrounded by his royal guard. What happened in the next minutes is depicted in one of the most famous artworks of the ancient world, the Alexander mosaic from Pompeii, which shows the moment of their near encounter with extraordinary detail. Darius in his chariot, his face a study in dawning horror, Alexander galloping toward him, his spear levelled, Persian soldiers dying around the chariot, the king's charioteer turning the vehicle to flee. Darius fled, and when the great king fled, the Persian army began to collapse. It was not immediate. The Greek mercenaries in the centre fought on. The Persian cavalry on the left continued pressing Parmenion's wing for a while, but once the heart of the Persian formation began to dissolve, the outcome was determined. The Macedonians pursued the retreating Persians with ferocity. The casualties in the Persian army were enormous. Tens of thousands died not in the battle itself, but in the rout, cut down by cavalry on open ground with nowhere to shelter. Darius escaped. He ran so fast and so far that he left behind his chariot, his weapons, his royal cloak, his mother, his wife, and his children in the camp that the Persians had established behind their lines. When Alexander entered the camp and found the royal family of Persia in his hands, he treated them with conspicuous courtesy. He told Darius's mother, Sisygambis, that she had not lost a son but gained one. He allowed the women to keep their servants and their royal honours. He treated Darius's wife with respect. This was partly genuine courtesy and partly brilliant politics. The way a conqueror treats the royal family of his enemy says everything about what kind of ruler he intends to be in the conquered territory. Alexander was announcing his intentions clearly. He was not here to humiliate, he was here to replace. After Issus, Alexander had two paths available to him. He could pursue Darius directly, following him east in an attempt to finish the war immediately, or he could secure the Mediterranean coast first, eliminating the Persian navy's bases before moving inland. He chose the coast. It was the strategically correct decision, even though it meant leaving Darius free to rebuild his army. The Persian navy was still a threat. Egypt was still a potentially hostile province to the south, and there was a city on the coast of what is now Lebanon that was going to require Alexander's full attention. That city was Tyre. The siege of Tyre and the desert road to Egypt. Tyre was built on an island. That is the essential fact of the siege, and everything else flows from it. Old Tyre, on the mainland of what is now Lebanon, had already fallen to Alexander without significant resistance. But New Tyre, the wealthier and more important part of the city, sat on a rocky island approximately half a mile from the shore. It was surrounded by walls that rose in some places to a height of over 150 feet. It had a deep water harbour. It had a garrison of determined defenders, and it had the Persian navy, which could supply and reinforce it almost indefinitely as long as Alexander did not control the sea. The Tyrians offered Alexander a compromise. He could worship at the temple of Melkart, whom he identified with Heracles, his own divine ancestor. He could make his offerings and sacrifice and then leave. Tyre would remain neutral. Alexander refused. He wanted the harbour. He wanted the city. He wanted to eliminate every possible base for the Persian fleet along the eastern Mediterranean coast, and Tyre was the most important of them. He demanded that Tyre open its gates. The Tyrians executed his ambassadors and threw their bodies from the walls into the sea. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 months. It is one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering in the ancient world. Unable to reach the island by conventional means, Alexander ordered his engineers to build a causeway, a mole extending from the mainland across the half-mile of water to the island's walls. This project required enormous quantities of stone and timber. The engineers tore down old Tyre to provide the material. They constructed wooden towers at the seaward end of the mole to protect the workers. They built siege engines and mounted them on the causeway. The Tyrians defended themselves with ingenuity and ferocity. They sent fire ships against the wooden towers and burned them. They built their own siege engines on the city walls and used them to drop heavy rocks on the workers. Their divers went out at night and cut the anchor ropes of the Macedonian siege equipment. They poured hot sand from the walls onto attacking soldiers. The sand, heated to extreme temperatures, got inside armour and burned continuously. This is described in ancient sources as one of the most agonizing experiences of the siege. Alexander responded to each defensive innovation with engineering solutions. He widened the causeway. He brought in ships, having gained control of the Phoenician and Cypriot fleets whose cities had surrendered to him, giving him enough naval power to challenge the Tyrian harbour. He mounted siege equipment on the ships themselves, and slowly, after months of effort that frustrated everyone involved, he got close enough to the walls to start battering them. The walls of Tyre fell in the summer of 332. When the Macedonians broke through, the fighting inside the city was brutal. Alexander typically was in the first wave through the breach, which was simultaneously inspiring and terrifying to the men around him. The city fell. The Tyrians who had survived the fighting, perhaps 30,000 people, were sold into slavery. 2,000 men of military age were crucified along the beach. The punishment was savage and deliberate. Alexander needed the next city to understand what the price of prolonged resistance was. Gaza, to the south on the road to Egypt, offered resistance anyway. Its garrison was commanded by a Persian eunuch named Battis, who held the city for several weeks before it fell. When Gaza was finally taken, Alexander ordered Battis dragged behind a chariot around the city walls, a treatment that mirrored what Achilles had done to the body of Hector outside Troy. Whether this was conscious Homeric self-dramatization, or simply rage at someone who had cost him weeks of time, is not entirely clear, and maybe both. The incident disturbed several of his companions who found it excessive. Then the road to Egypt, and Egypt was something else entirely. The Persian satrap of Egypt, Mazaches, had received no reinforcements from Darius after Issus, and no particular reason to fight for a king who had abandoned his own family on a battlefield. When Alexander arrived at the border of Egypt, Mazaches surrendered the country without a battle. Egypt received Alexander as a liberator. The Egyptians had never been particularly happy under Persian rule. The Persians had sometimes interfered with Egyptian religious practices, which the Egyptians regarded as outrageous, and the memory of Persian kings who had reportedly killed the sacred Apis bull was still very much alive. Alexander, by contrast, went immediately to Memphis and performed the traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies. He sacrificed to Apis. He performed the rituals expected of a pharaoh. He was received not as a foreign conqueror but as the rightful ruler. And then he went to the oracle. Son of Amun, Egypt, the oracle, and a god is born. The oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis was one of the most famous in the ancient world, and Alexander had decided he needed to hear what it had to say. Whether he needed confirmation, validation, or simply the theatrical weight of a divine endorsement delivered in person, we cannot entirely know. What we know is that nothing short of an 8-day journey through the Libyan desert was going to stop him from getting there, and that when Alexander decided something needed to be done, the difficulty of doing it was never the part he focused on. Siwa sat deep in the sand, days of travel west from the Nile Valley, accessible only by routes that had defeated previous travellers. The desert between the Nile and the oasis was not hospitable territory. It was the kind of landscape that ancient sources tend to describe with slightly awed language, trackless, waterless, and hot in the specific way that deserts are hot, which is to say, relentlessly and without apology. Alexander took a small party. He travelled light. He went anyway. The ancient sources, writing later and with full knowledge of who Alexander became, decorated the journey with appropriate wonders. Ravens appeared and guided the party through the sand when they lost the route. Talking snakes were mentioned in at least one account, which feels like it may have been embellished somewhere along the transmission chain, though I confess I cannot say with certainty. Springs of fresh water appeared. Divine guidance manifested in various forms. This is what happens when a very famous person makes a journey and survives it. The surviving becomes miraculous in retrospect, and the miracles accumulate with each retelling. The Greeks and Macedonians identified Amun with Zeus, which meant that visiting the oracle of Amun was in their religious imagination something like visiting the oracle of Zeus himself, the king of the gods, the father of heroes. The added resonance was not accidental. Alexander had been hearing since childhood that his real father was Zeus, in the form of a serpent, that the night his mother Olympias had conceived him she had seen a lightning bolt, that he was something other and greater than an ordinary Macedonian prince. He had been carrying this story with him his whole life, considering it, half believing it, finding it useful, building a version of himself around it. The Oracle of Amun was the place where that story could be confirmed by an authority the world recognized. He arrived at the oasis. He consulted the priest of Amun in the inner sanctuary of the temple, in the private interior space where the god's voice was understood to speak, and then he came out. What the priest actually said to him, Alexander took to his grave. He wrote to his mother Olympias that he had received the answer he desired, and that he would share the full details with her in person. He never saw her again, as it turned out, which means whatever he was saving for that private conversation was never delivered. He left the oasis and said very little to anyone about what had happened inside. What leaked out, through sources that were presumably close enough to the situation to have some fragment of knowledge, was this. The priest had addressed him as the son of Amun, not as a petitioner, not as a foreign king seeking divine counsel, but as the son of the god himself. Alexander had received this without contradiction. Now, there is a reasonable explanation that does not require any supernatural component. In Egyptian religious and royal tradition, the pharaoh was always the son of the gods. It was not a statement about literal paternity. It was a title, a theological designation built into the formula of Egyptian kingship. When a new pharaoh arrived, the priests addressed him as the son of Amun because that is what pharaohs were, by definition, in the Egyptian religious framework. The priest may have simply been doing exactly what his role required of him. The formula would have been the same for any ruler standing in that place. But Alexander did not correct the formulation. He did not explain that he was actually of Macedonian royal descent on both sides. He accepted the address and carried it back out into the sunlight with him. Whether he believed it in the literal sense, whether he genuinely understood himself to be the biological offspring of a god, is a question the historical record cannot answer with certainty. What Alexander believed in the privacy of his own mind is not something we have access to. What we have access to is his behaviour, and his behaviour after Siwa suggests that whatever happened in that inner sanctuary, he emerged from it with something he had not quite possessed before, a settled, publicly expressed claim to divine origin that had previously been a family story and was now, from his perspective, an oracle's confirmation. This mattered enormously in the context of what he was trying to do. Being King of Macedon was impressive. Being hegemon of the Greek League was politically significant. But to claim divine descent, confirmed by a recognised oracle in the religious tradition of a country he had just been welcomed into as a liberator, was to make a different kind of claim entirely. It was to say that his authority was not merely inherited from Philip or granted by the Greeks, but that it came from a source beyond human politics. He was claiming to be a world ruler with cosmic sanction, something larger than a king, and that claim would shape his behaviour and his court and his relationships with his companions for the rest of his life. Not always comfortably. His Macedonian companions were, to put it diplomatically, less enthusiastic about the god business than Alexander himself. Macedonians were comfortable with a king who was the best among them, the strongest fighter, the wisest leader, the most generous host. A king who sat among them at dinner and drank with them and asked their opinions was something they understood. A king who might be a god, and who expected forms of reverence appropriate to divinity, was a rather more complicated proposition, and the tension between those two versions of Alexander would eventually produce some of the most painful episodes of the entire campaign. But all of that was still ahead. For now, in the spring of 332, Alexander left the Siwa oasis carrying whatever the priest had given him, turned back toward the Nile and descended from the western desert to the coast. He had decided to build a city. This was, by this point in the campaign, something Alexander did with some regularity. He had been founding settlements since the beginning of the Eastern expedition, planting garrisons and veterans in strategic locations, creating nodes of Macedonian and Greek presence across the territories he was moving through. But this city was different. He felt it as different, or at least the sources suggest he did, because he gave its planning a degree of personal attention that was unusual even for him. He chose a site on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast, a narrow strip of land between the sea and a large lake called Mareotis, a site with natural harbour access on multiple sides, a healthy prevailing wind, and a position that made it an obvious junction point between the sea trade routes of the Mediterranean and the agricultural wealth of the Nile Valley. It was, from a commercial and strategic geography standpoint, nearly perfect. He walked the layout of the city himself. His architects had chalk for marking boundaries, and then apparently the chalk ran out, so they used grain instead, pouring it along the ground in the lines where the streets and walls and public spaces were to go. A flock of birds descended and ate the grain. Alexander's seers interpreted this as a favourable omen, meaning the city would be wealthy and would feed many peoples. Alexander, in a characteristic move, accepted this interpretation rather than worrying about what it said about the durability of grain-based urban planning. The city was called Alexandria. He named many cities after himself throughout the campaign, and most of them remained provincial outposts, important in local terms but not world historically significant. This one became something else entirely. It became the greatest city in the ancient world. Its library, built by his successor Ptolemy, and expanded over generations, aspired to hold a copy of every book ever written, dispatching agents to every port with instructions to copy any text they found. Its lighthouse rose to a height that made it visible 40 miles out at sea and was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Its scholars produced work that shaped the history of human knowledge: Euclid's geometry, Eratosthenes' calculation of the Earth's circumference, Herophilus' systematic study of human anatomy, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that would eventually shape the entire Christian and much of the Islamic intellectual tradition. All of it happened in the city that Alexander laid out with borrowed grain on an Egyptian beach. He left Egypt in the spring of 331 and never came back. He turned east toward Darius, who had spent the months of the Egyptian interlude rebuilding his army on the plains of Mesopotamia. The greatest battle of Alexander's life was waiting for him: Gaugamela, the battle that broke an empire. Darius had not been idle. After Issus, he had retreated into the Persian heartland and spent the months of Alexander's Egyptian sojourn rebuilding and re-equipping his army. He sent peace proposals to Alexander. He offered to share the Persian Empire, to give Alexander all territory west of the Euphrates River, to pay an enormous ransom for his captured family, and to seal the deal with a political marriage. These were not contemptible offers. They represented a recognition of Macedonian military power and a genuine attempt to end the war on terms that left both rulers intact. Parmenion, Alexander's senior general, reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept. Alexander said that if he were Parmenion, so would he. The message was clear. Alexander was not fighting for a piece of the Persian Empire. He was fighting for all of it. Darius had equipped his new army with improvements designed to counter Macedonian tactics. He had scythe-wheeled chariots fitted with blades extending from the wheels, designed to cut through infantry formations. He had a larger contingent of elephants from India. He had chosen a location for the decisive battle, the wide-open plain of Gaugamela near modern Erbil in what is now northern Iraq, and he had the plain levelled specifically so that his cavalry and chariots would have the best possible ground. He had, in short, prepared as thoroughly as any commander could prepare, and it was not enough. Alexander arrived in the region and his scouts surveyed the Persian position. Several senior officers, including Parmenion, recommended a night attack to prevent the Persians from making effective use of their superior numbers. Alexander refused. He is reported to have said that he would not steal a victory. This sounds like pure rhetoric, and it probably is partly that, but there was also a practical consideration. Night attacks in the ancient world were inherently chaotic, and an army that became disordered in the dark risked losing its cohesion, which was exactly what Macedonian tactics depended upon. Alexander slept before Gaugamela, soundly apparently, which his officers found remarkable enough to record. Either he was genuinely that calm, or he had learned to compartmentalize his anxiety so completely that external observers could not detect it. Parmenion had to wake him in the morning. The Persian army was waiting in its prepared position. Darius had placed his best Bactrian cavalry on the left, his royal guard infantry in the centre around himself, and additional cavalry on the right. He had placed the scythed chariots in front, ready to drive through the Macedonian line. Alexander responded with an oblique advance. He moved his entire line to the right as he advanced, which had the effect of dragging the Persian left wing to try to match him, pulling it away from the centre. This was deliberate. He was looking for the gap, the moment when the Persian line stretched and thinned and opened. Darius launched the scythed chariots. They drove toward the Macedonian line. The Macedonians, following what appears to have been a prepared response, opened their lines, let the chariots through, and then closed around them, killing the crews with javelins and spears from the sides. It was a devastating countermeasure to an expensive weapon, and it left Darius's opening move in ruins. On the Persian left, the Bactrian cavalry surged forward and drove into Alexander's right flank. Macedonian cavalry met them and a melee developed. On the Persian right, the cavalry moved against Parmenion's wing and drove it back, threatening to roll around the Macedonian left. And then the gap appeared. The Persian left, stretched thin by following Alexander's oblique advance, opened. There was a space between the Bactrian cavalry engaged on the left and the centre of the line where Darius stood. Alexander drove into it with the companion cavalry at full gallop, in wedge formation, aimed directly at the Persian king. The account of what followed is one of the most dramatic in ancient military history. Alexander's cavalry smashed through the gap and drove toward Darius. The Persian royal guard fought desperately to protect their king. Alexander was close enough that Persian generals and nobles around Darius were being cut down. The centre of the Persian line, seeing the cavalry of the Macedonian king driving toward their king, began to break. Darius fled, for the second time, and again the pursuit was complicated. On the other side of the battlefield, Parmenion's left wing was in serious trouble. The Persian cavalry had broken through and was looping around behind the Macedonian line. Parmenion sent an urgent message to Alexander requesting support. Alexander had Darius in front of him and pursuit in his blood. He pulled back from the chase and turned to help Parmenion. It was the correct decision militarily. It may have cost him Darius. Persian cavalry that had broken through retreated when Alexander's force turned toward them. By the time Alexander returned to the pursuit, Darius had too great a head start. But the battle was won, decisively, completely, and permanently. The Persian Empire did not have another army of this quality to put in the field. Darius had now fled from Alexander twice, and the second time had abandoned every remaining symbol of Persian royal power. The empire, in any meaningful military sense, was finished. Gaugamela was fought on October 1st, 331 before the Common Era. On that afternoon, 3,000 years of Persian imperial history effectively ended. Not with a dramatic final stand, not with a king dying sword in hand, but with a chariot retreating across a flat plain in the dust of a battle that had lasted a few hours. The world's largest empire won and lost in a single afternoon, and a 25-year-old from Macedonia standing in the middle of it, wondering which direction Darius had gone. Babylon, Persepolis, and the weight of victory. After Gaugamela, the great cities of the Persian Empire opened before Alexander like a series of locked doors that had lost their keys. Babylon came first. Babylon, one of the oldest and most magnificent cities in the world, city of the Hanging Gardens, city of the ziggurat, ancient capital of ancient empires, approached Alexander's advance guard and surrendered without a fight. The Persian satrap Mazaeus came out to meet Alexander with his sons, presenting himself and the city in a formal act of submission. The Babylonian priests and population lined the road leading into the city, strewing it with flowers, burning incense, and greeting the Macedonian king as a liberator from Persian rule. Alexander entered Babylon in state. He restored the temples that the Persian king Xerxes had damaged or destroyed. He made offerings to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, performing the rituals expected of a Babylonian king. He was announced as the king of Babylon, the king of the four corners of the earth, and the king of Sumer and Akkad. These were ancient titles with ancient resonances, and by using them Alexander was placing himself in a line of Babylonian kingship that stretched back to Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. He also gave his soldiers 2 weeks of rest in Babylon, which after the march from Egypt and the Battle of Gaugamela they needed desperately. Susa, the Persian administrative capital, fell next. It too surrendered without significant resistance. The treasuries of Susa contained wealth so staggering that it required hundreds of camels and mules to transport it. Gold, silver, jewellery, regalia, and the tribute of nations accumulated over generations by the Achaemenid kings. The ancient sources give figures for the Susa treasury alone that would be almost incomprehensible even today. Alexander sent much of it back to Macedonia, effectively solving the kingdom's finances for a generation. Then came Persepolis, and Persepolis is where the story gets complicated. Persepolis was the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the city that the Achaemenid kings had built over generations to be the visible expression of their glory. Its great reception hall, the Apadana, could hold 10,000 standing men. Its carved reliefs showed the subject peoples of the empire bringing tribute, procession after procession, of representatives from every corner of Persian territory, each in their own costume, carrying their own gifts. It was, in purely visual terms, one of the most extraordinary statements of imperial power in the ancient world. Alexander took Persepolis in the spring of 330, and he held it for several months. He took its treasuries, which were even larger than those of Susa. He executed the satrap who had attempted to strip the city before fleeing, and then, one night, he burned the royal palace. The accounts of why this happened differ. Some ancient sources say that it was a deliberate political act, the burning of Persepolis as a symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in 480, a statement to the Greek world that the old debt had been repaid. This interpretation has a certain logic to it. Alexander had presented his campaign partly in terms of revenge for the Persian wars, and the destruction of the Persian royal seat by fire was a satisfying symmetry. Other ancient sources say that the burning was the result of a drunken decision made during a party, that an Athenian courtesan named Thais had made a speech encouraging the act, that Alexander, in a moment of intoxicated enthusiasm, had seized a torch and begun the fire himself, and that he regretted it in the morning. Both stories may be partly true. The public justification may have been the revenge narrative, while the actual trigger may indeed have been a drunken evening. Alexander burned Persepolis and, according to some sources, looked back at the smoke rising from the ruins and said that the Persians had been punished, but that he felt no pleasure in it. The fire is one of the most debated moments in Alexander's campaign. Those who see him as primarily a destroyer point to it. Those who see him as primarily a builder note that Babylon's temples, the religious sites of every city he captured, were protected and restored, and that the burning of Persepolis was the exception rather than the rule. What it suggests, I think, is that Alexander was neither the saint that his most enthusiastic admirers have made him, nor the monster that his most determined critics have called him. He was something more complicated and more human. A young man of extraordinary capabilities and genuine instincts of generosity, who was also capable, in certain circumstances, of destructive excess. Persepolis was burned. Darius was still alive. The war was not yet over. The ends of the known world. Into Central Asia, Darius did not die in battle. He did not, in the end, make a heroic last stand. He fled east from Gaugamela with a bodyguard, moved through the Iranian plateau, and tried to rebuild some kind of resistance from the eastern reaches of his empire. Alexander pursued him with the relentless patience of a man who understood that an enemy king still breathing is always a problem. The chase took Alexander east through Parthia and into what is now the border region between Iran and the Central Asian republics, and in the summer of 330, in the desperate chaos of the pursuit, Darius was murdered. His killers were not Macedonians. They were his own satraps and courtiers, led by a Bactrian nobleman named Bessus. They saw the situation clearly. Darius had lost 2 great battles, lost his family, lost his treasury, and lost most of his empire. He was a liability, and Bessus intended to take control of the eastern Persian territories, proclaim himself king, and fight Alexander from a position of independent power rather than in service of a discredited ruler. They stabbed Darius, threw him in a cart, and fled east. Alexander found the cart with the body still warm. According to Plutarch, he covered the body with his own royal cloak. He arranged for Darius to be buried with full royal honours in the tombs of the Achaemenid kings at Persepolis. This was not simply sentiment. By treating the dead Darius as a legitimate king, Alexander was positioning himself as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. Darius had not been defeated by a barbarian invader. He had been betrayed and murdered by rebels, and Alexander was now the avenger of the legitimate king. He declared Bessus a traitor and a murderer and announced his pursuit. What followed was a campaign unlike anything that had come before. The territories east of Persia proper, Bactria and Sogdia, the regions of what is now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, were not like the flat plains of Mesopotamia or the cultivated valleys of Anatolia. They were mountains and deserts, high plateaus and narrow gorges. The people were tough, warlike, and entirely uninterested in submitting to a distant king on the basis of battlefield victories elsewhere. The Persian Empire had always had difficulty governing these regions. Alexander was about to discover why. The campaign in Bactria and Sogdia lasted approximately 3 years, from 329 to 327, and it was the hardest fighting Alexander's army faced in the entire expedition, not because of great pitched battles, though there were battles, but because of the grinding, exhausting nature of counterinsurgency warfare in terrain that seemed designed to defeat invaders. The winter of 329 included a crossing of the Hindu Kush mountains that is still studied by military historians as an example of logistical determination against enormous odds. The army crossed passes at heights of over 12,000 feet in winter conditions, with inadequate supplies and men who were equipped for the Mediterranean summer from which they had come. Altitude sickness, frostbite, and starvation killed men who had survived every battle of the campaign. They crossed it anyway. Bessus was eventually caught and handed over to Alexander by one of his own allies. Alexander sent him to the family of Darius for punishment, in accordance with Persian royal custom. Bessus was mutilated in the Persian manner, his ears and nose cut off, and then executed. It was brutal, and it was deliberate. Alexander was administering Persian justice according to Persian law, signalling to the Persian aristocracy that he respected their legal traditions. But the killing of Bessus did not end the resistance in the east. A Sogdian nobleman named Spitamenes proved far more troublesome than Bessus had ever been, precisely because he refused to fight pitched battles that Alexander could win. Instead, he led guerrilla raids, striking at supply lines and isolated detachments, disappearing into the steppe before Alexander could catch him. He massacred a Macedonian force sent to accept the surrender of one garrison, an event that shocked the army with its brutality and reminded them that they were not invincible. Alexander responded with a combination of ferocity and adaptation. He built a network of garrison cities across the region to hold territory. He incorporated local cavalry into his army. He learned from the environment and adjusted his tactics. He hunted Spitamenes relentlessly across thousands of miles of steppe, mountains, and desert. Spitamenes was eventually killed by his own allies among the Massagetæ nomads, who were afraid of what Alexander would do to them if they continued sheltering him. His head was sent to Alexander. During the Bactrian campaign, Alexander married. Her name was Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates. According to the ancient sources, she was either a hostage brought before Alexander after the capture of a mountain fortress, or a woman he met at a banquet, or possibly both. Alexander married her formally, which was unexpected enough that his Macedonian companions were startled. He was the king. He was expected to take concubines from conquered territories. Marriage implied something more serious. Some historians have argued this was pure politics, an attempt to reconcile the Bactrian aristocracy to Macedonian rule by marrying into it. Others suggest genuine feeling. The truth is probably a combination. What is clear is that Roxana travelled with Alexander for the rest of his campaign, and that she was carrying his child when he died. That child would eventually be recognised as Alexander IV, though his story did not end well, as stories of children of great conquerors rarely do. But before India, before the Great Eastern March, there were other complications, and they were not military. The Dark Turn, murder, paranoia, and the killing of Cleitus Alexander changed in Central Asia. This is not a controversial historical observation. It is something the ancient sources agree on, something you can trace through the record of events, something his companions noticed and wrote about. The man who arrived in Bactria was not entirely the same man who had crossed the Hellespont 4 years earlier. The change had multiple dimensions. The drinking became heavier, which was not unusual for a Macedonian nobleman on campaign, but the degree to which it increased was noted. He began adopting Persian court customs more extensively, wearing Persian dress, expecting Persian forms of obeisance. He began surrounding himself with eunuchs and Persian courtiers in ways that his Macedonian companions found alienating. The blurring of the line between Greek and Persian culture that he had been practicing since Gaugamela was accelerating, and not everyone around him was comfortable with it. Most significantly, he began raising the question of proskynesis. This was the Persian custom by which subjects prostrated themselves before the king, a full bow with the face to the ground. For Persians, this was simply a mark of respect for royal authority. For Greeks and Macedonians, it was a gesture reserved for the gods. It was not something humans did before other humans. To require it was to claim divine status in a way that no Macedonian king had previously done, and that made Alexander's companions deeply, viscerally uncomfortable. He pushed the matter at a banquet in Bactria, attempting to introduce proskynesis as a standard greeting. The philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had been travelling with the army as its official historian and had up to this point been quite useful to Alexander's propaganda, refused. He made a long, elegant speech about the distinction between divine and human honour. He would not bow. Alexander, apparently recognising that forcing the issue would create a crisis he was not ready to handle, backed down. But he did not forget. Callisthenes was subsequently implicated in a genuine plot against Alexander's life, the Pages' Conspiracy, in which a group of royal pages who served in Alexander's household planned his assassination. The plot was discovered, the pages were tortured and executed. Callisthenes, who appears not to have been an active conspirator but who had certainly been critical of Alexander in ways that the pages had heard, was arrested. He died in custody, either from illness or execution, before he could be tried. The exact truth of what happened to Callisthenes is disputed. The death of Callisthenes damaged Alexander's relationship with Aristotle permanently. The philosopher had given him his education. The king had imprisoned, or allowed to die, his teacher's nephew. The warmth of their correspondence ended. But before all of this, before Callisthenes and the pages, there was Cleitus the Black. The man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River by severing the arm of Spithridates before the killing blow could fall. A senior cavalry officer, a man who had fought beside Alexander since the beginning of the campaign. A man, crucially, who remembered Alexander as a prince and as a young king, who had known Philip, who had grown up in the court at Pella when things were simpler. At a banquet at Maracanda in Sogdia in the autumn of 328, Alexander and his companions were drinking heavily. The conversation turned to comparisons between the great Macedonian commanders of the past, Philip's generals, and the current leadership. Some of the flattery at the table became excessive, praising Alexander's achievements as surpassing those of his father, surpassing the heroes of mythology. Alexander received this with what appeared to be satisfaction. Cleitus, drunk and apparently past the point of caution, pushed back. He defended Philip's honour. He reminded the table that it was the Macedonians who had won these victories, not Alexander alone. He spoke critically of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, his divine pretensions, his treatment of his Macedonian companions. He said things that needed to be said and that should probably have been said at a different time by a sober person. Alexander's temper, always close to the surface when he was drinking, ignited. The argument escalated. Alexander threw an apple at Cleitus. He looked for a weapon. Companions between them tried to defuse the situation. Cleitus was pulled away once, left the room, was persuaded to return, came back and continued his criticism. Alexander seized a spear from one of his guards and drove it through Clitus. There are moments in history that seem almost impossible to process, that reveal something about human nature in its most raw and irreducible state. The killing of Clitus is one of them. Alexander killed the man who had saved his life. He killed one of his oldest and most loyal companions. He killed him in a drunken rage over words spoken at a dinner table. The aftermath was appalling to witness. Alexander realized what he had done almost immediately. He tried to kill himself with the same spear and was physically restrained by his guards. He spent 3 days in his tent refusing food and water, paralyzed by grief and self-reproach, calling out the names of Clitus and Clitus's sister, who had been Alexander's nurse. His companions feared he would die. Eventually he was coaxed back to life, partly by the philosopher Anaxarchus, who told him that a king's actions were by definition right because a king stood above ordinary law. This was not the most helpful or accurate philosophy Alexander had ever been exposed to, but it served to end the immediate crisis. He emerged from his tent. The army moved on, but Clitus was still dead. And something in Alexander that had been cracking slowly under the pressure of years of campaign and isolation and the constant burden of being something extraordinary cracked a little more. He became more suspicious, more quick to anger, more inclined to see criticism as betrayal. The man who had wept at the Granicus because Clitus had saved his life was the same man who had killed Clitus in the same decade. What that says about the costs of power, of isolation, of alcohol, of the particular pressures that this campaign placed on a human being who was always being asked to be more than human, is something I leave to you to consider as you drift towards sleep. The edge of the world, India and the mutiny at the Hydaspes, in 327, before the Common Era, Alexander's army crossed the Hindu Kush again, this time going east, heading into what is now Pakistan. This was territory beyond the boundaries of the old Persian Empire, territory that was unknown to Greek geography except in the haziest terms. The ancient sources, including Aristotle, had believed that the world ended somewhere east of Persia, that beyond the edges of the known world there was only the great outer ocean. Alexander intended to find it. The campaign in the Indus Valley region was extraordinary in multiple ways. The army crossed the Khyber Pass, fought against local tribes in the mountain valleys above the Indus, took fortified positions that seemed impregnable, and descended into the rich agricultural plains of the Punjab. Alexander founded cities, established garrisons, and sent diplomatic missions to the local rulers demanding their submission. Many submitted, some fought. One mountain fortress called Ornus was believed to be impossible to capture, a great rock rising from the surrounding countryside, because local traditions said that even Heracles, Alexander's divine ancestor, had failed to take it. Alexander took it. The combination of Homeric ambition and remarkable military engineering that characterized his entire campaign was on full display. He could not resist a challenge that Heracles had supposedly failed, and his engineers found the route up the rock that everyone else had missed. The decisive engagement of the Indian campaign came at the Hydaspes River, the modern Jhelum in Pakistan, in May of 326. On the far bank waited Porus, a king of the Punjab, who commanded an army that included 200 war elephants. War elephants were genuinely terrifying to armies that had not encountered them before. They were enormous, they were armoured, they were commanded from above by riders called mahouts. They carried soldiers in wooden towers on their backs, and when they charged they could break infantry lines and trample horses. Macedonian horses that had never seen elephants would not go near them. This was a serious tactical problem. Alexander solved it partly through preparation, training his horses to the sight and smell and sound of elephants, and partly through tactical innovation. He crossed the river at night in a thunderstorm, catching Porus's scouts off guard, and advanced before the full elephant force could be deployed. In the battle that followed, the Macedonian cavalry worked around the flanks of the elephant line while light troops harassed the animals with javelins and missiles, aiming at the sensitive areas, the feet and the trunks, that would drive an elephant into panic. Panicked elephants were as dangerous to the side that used them as to the enemy. Porus fought with extraordinary courage. He remained on the back of his largest elephant throughout the battle, directing his forces, wounded multiple times, and only surrendered when it was physically impossible to continue. When he was brought before Alexander, asked how he wished to be treated, he replied like a king. Alexander was apparently delighted by this answer and gave it to him. Porus was treated with conspicuous honour and restored to his kingdom as an ally and tributary king. He remained loyal for the rest of Alexander's life. But the Battle of the Hydaspes was also where Bucephalus died. The horse had carried Alexander across 3 continents and 2 decades. He had been wounded in the battle or died of age and exhaustion in the aftermath. Alexander grieved him with the intensity of someone who has lost a companion that no human being could quite replace. He founded a city on the site of the battle and named it Bucephala. The army moved east. Alexander wanted to continue, to reach the great river that Greek geographers believed marked the eastern edge of the subcontinent. Local kings submitted or were conquered. The campaign continued to be costly and difficult. The monsoon rains had been falling for months, and the army was wet, tired, sick, and far from home. And then they reached the Hydaspes River, the modern Bees, and stopped, or rather, they refused to cross it. The refusal was not dramatic or violent. It took the form of a growing silence that spread through the army over a period of days. Alexander called an assembly of his commanders and announced that they would continue east. He gave a speech about glory and the bounds of the world and the great achievements that awaited them. He reminded them who they were and what they had accomplished. The response was silence. Conus, one of his most experienced generals, spoke for the army. He was respectful and careful, but he was also honest in a way that almost no one in Alexander's court could be anymore. He said that the men were exhausted, that they had marched tens of thousands of miles from home, that they had left their families behind for 8 years, that they longed to go back, to see their parents and wives and children while there was still time to do so. He spoke of the dead, of everything the campaign had cost, and he said with quiet directness that the greatest of all conquests was to know when to stop. Alexander was furious. He went into his tent and refused to come out for 3 days, hoping that the army would relent, that the silence would break, that his generals would return to tell him the men were ready to march. They did not. They waited, and the waiting said everything. On the 3rd day, Alexander performed a sacrifice, and the omens came back unfavourable, which was the theological mechanism by which he could acknowledge reality, without appearing to give in to pressure from his men. He announced that the gods did not wish him to continue east. He had respected divine will. The army, when they heard this, wept with relief and celebrated with the enthusiasm of men whose death sentence has been commuted. They knew what the unfavourable omens meant. They were going home. Alexander ordered 12 enormous altars built on the banks of the Hydaspes, one for each of the Olympian gods, marking the boundary of his campaign. He left them as monuments to the furthest point his army had reached, offerings to gods who had apparently decided that the world was large enough. He was 29 years old, and he had just discovered that there was something in the world he could not command. The long road home, the Gadrosian desert, and the cost of empire. The return from India was not the triumphal march home that the army might have hoped for. Alexander chose a route that turned out to be catastrophic, and the reasons he chose it remain debated by historians to this day. After building his altars on the Hydaspes, Alexander turned south, following the Indus River toward the sea. This was sound strategy in one sense. He needed to demonstrate Macedonian power along the river valleys, reduce any remaining pockets of resistance, and eventually reach the coast of the Arabian Sea, where he planned to send a fleet under his admiral Granicus to explore the sea route between India and Persia, a route that no Greek had previously travelled. The river campaign was tough. Several Indian tribes and cities fought back with ferocity. The most dangerous incident came at a city of the Mali tribe, where Alexander, in his characteristic fashion, was the first man over the wall. He jumped down into the city from the top of the wall with a handful of companions, found himself surrounded by enemies, and was struck by an arrow that penetrated through his armour into his lung. He nearly died. His companions broke down the wall in a frenzy to reach him, and by the time they did he had lost so much blood that he was unconscious and barely breathing. The army went into a panic. Reports spread that he was dead. When he was finally carried out of the city still breathing, placed on a stretcher and shown to his troops, men wept openly with relief. He was months recovering from the wound, and it left him permanently weakened. But he recovered. By the autumn of 325, the army had reached the coast and Alexander was ready to send Granicus with the fleet. Then came the decision that would haunt him. He chose to lead the main army back to Persia through the Gadrosian desert. This is modern Baluchistan in Pakistan and Iran, one of the most inhospitable environments on earth. The coastal route through the desert had defeated previous armies. The Persian queen Semiramis, a semi-legendary figure, had allegedly lost most of her army there. Cyrus the Great had lost most of his army there. Alexander knew this. He went anyway. There are various explanations for the decision. Some historians suggest he was trying to surpass the legendary failures of his predecessors. Some suggest he believed the desert could be crossed more easily than tradition held. Some suggest he wanted to march along the coast in order to supply Nearchus's fleet as it sailed parallel. The last explanation is probably the most practical, though the supply mission failed almost entirely because the desert had virtually nothing to offer. The march through the Gedrosian desert was the worst thing Alexander's army endured in the entire campaign. Worse than the Hindu Kush in winter, worse than Central Asian guerrilla warfare, worse than any battle. The heat was extreme, water was scarce beyond imagination. What supplies they had ran out almost immediately. Men and animals died by the thousands. The ancient sources describe scenes of desperate horror, people digging in dry riverbeds for moisture, men drowning when a flash flood filled a wadi while they slept, animals dying and being butchered and eaten raw, stragglers who fell behind being left because the army could not stop, women and children who had been travelling with the army dying in the desert by the hundreds, soldiers so maddened by thirst that they drank salt water and died even faster. Alexander suffered alongside his men. When his soldiers were desperately thirsty and a small amount of water was found, it was brought to him in a helmet as a gift. He poured it into the sand. He would not drink when his men could not drink. This gesture, whether calculated or genuinely spontaneous, meant everything to the men who witnessed it. Perhaps 60 days, perhaps a little more. The army emerged from the Gedrosian desert onto the Persian plateau with a fraction of the force that had entered it. The exact death toll will never be known. Some estimates suggest that more men died in the Gedrosian desert than in all the battles of the campaign combined. Alexander's return to Persia was followed by a period of reorganization, punishment, and in some cases extreme measures against satraps and officials who had mismanaged or enriched themselves during his absence. Some were executed. He was reasserting control over an empire that had been running itself for years and had not always run itself well. He was also drinking more. He was grieving more. He had lost Bucephalus. He had lost the push east. He had lost men by the tens of thousands in a desert that he had walked them into. Whatever interior balance he had maintained through the campaigns was under serious strain. Ahead lay Babylon, and in Babylon everything was going to end. The final years. Babylon. The plans that never were, and a king unravelling Alexander entered Babylon in 324 before the Common Era with plans so vast that they make even his completed conquests seem like preparation for something larger. He wanted to circumnavigate Arabia, and he was building a fleet for it. Enormous ships constructed in Babylon and transported down the Euphrates in sections to be assembled at the coast. Arabia was practically unknown to Greek geography. Its coastline had never been fully charted. Its interior was a mystery. Alexander wanted it. He wanted to conquer the Western Mediterranean. There are references in ancient sources, possibly from documents in his royal archive, to plans for campaigns in Carthage and North Africa, in Italy, in Spain. Whether these were genuine strategic intentions or the dreams of a man who could not stop thinking of things to conquer is debated, but the ambition behind them was entirely consistent with everything Alexander had ever said or done. He had turned west at the Hyphasis. There was still a whole direction left. He was reorganizing his army, integrating Persian and Asian soldiers alongside the Macedonians in a way that infuriated many of his veterans. He was sending Macedonian veterans home with generous gifts, which was partly a reward and partly a way of managing the tension between the older Macedonian soldiers who wanted to go home and the new troops he was training. There was a mutiny of sorts at Opis, where the Macedonian veterans protested his Persianizing of the army and his apparent preference for Persian courtiers. Alexander's response was first fury and then reconciliation, staging a great banquet of reconciliation that ancient sources describe in terms of extraordinary warmth. But the shadow hanging over all of it was Hephaestion. Hephaestion had been Alexander's closest companion since childhood, possibly since before Aristotle, since the years at Pella when they were boys together. He was present at every major event of the campaign. He commanded cavalry. He led diplomatic missions. He managed logistics. He was, in the eyes of the ancient sources and of Alexander himself, his Alexander's alter ego, his Patroclus to Alexander's Achilles. When Alexander visited Troy at the beginning of the campaign and honoured Achilles, Hephaestion had honoured Patroclus. The parallel was deliberately invoked and deeply meant. In the autumn of 324, Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana. He died within days. Alexander's grief was total and terrifying. He refused food and water for days. He ordered the sacred flame at Ecbatana extinguished, which was traditionally done only at the death of a great king. He cut his own hair in mourning, echoing what Achilles had done at the death of Patroclus. He ordered Hephaestion's doctor crucified. He launched a savage punitive campaign against a local tribe, partly as a way of channeling his grief into action. He sent to the oracle of Amun asking whether Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. The oracle said he could be honoured as a divine hero, which was the second rank below full divinity. Alexander accepted this, perhaps with some disappointment. He ordered an enormous funeral monument prepared at Babylon, of a scale so ambitious that it may never have been fully completed. He did not recover from Hephaestion's death. Not in the months that remained to him. He continued to plan, to build, to organise, but something had gone. The friend he had carried with him since boyhood was gone. The Achilles who had arrived at Troy was now truly alone, his Patroclus dead, the war not yet finished. He was drinking heavily. He was giving extravagant gifts to people he favoured. He was making sudden, impulsive decisions that alarmed his advisors. He received embassies from across the known world in Babylon, including apparently from some Italian peoples, some of whom may have been Romans, though the Roman sources that record this are later and hard to evaluate. He listened, he planned, he prepared. And then in late May of 323 before the Common Era, at a banquet in Babylon, he fell ill. The death of Alexander and the world he left behind. The ancient sources differ on the details of how Alexander died. They agree on the timeline. Beginning around June 1st of 323, Alexander developed a fever. He continued to perform his duties for the first several days, attending sacrifices, consulting with officers, planning the Arabian expedition. Then he became too ill to leave his rooms. Over the following days, the fever worsened. He was moved to the palace gardens where it was cooler. His soldiers, who had heard rumours of his illness and feared another report of death, like the one that had spread after the Indian campaign, demanded to see him. He received them lying on his bed, too weak to speak but able to recognise faces and gesture in greeting. He was 32 years old. The cause of his death is one of the great medical mysteries of antiquity. Ancient sources suggest typhoid fever complicated by his ongoing drinking and by the lung wound from the Mali campaign. Some modern scholars have proposed bacterial meningitis. Others have suggested poisoning. Arsenic has been proposed, which would explain the unusual delay between symptom onset and death, and the apparent preservation of the body for days after death, which ancient sources note. If it was poison, the suspects are numerous. His generals who expected to inherit pieces of the empire. Olympias, who was playing her own political games back in Macedonia and might have had reasons. The Aristotelian connection, given what had happened to Callisthenes. Macedonian veterans who resented the Persianizing of the court. The list is long and the evidence is thin. Most historians today incline toward natural causes, typhoid or something similar, while acknowledging that we simply cannot know. As he weakened, his generals gathered. They asked him to whom he left the kingdom. The account that has him saying to the strongest is probably legendary. More likely by that stage he was beyond coherent speech. He gave his ring to Perdiccas, one of his senior generals, which was interpreted as a designation of some kind of authority, though exactly what authority he intended was immediately disputed. On June 10th or 11th of 323 before the Common Era, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. He had reigned for 12 years, 8 months, and some days. He had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to the borders of India, from the Black Sea to the edge of the Sahara. He had never lost a battle. He had founded cities across 3 continents. He had changed the political and cultural map of the known world so thoroughly that the changes were still visible in the time of Julius Caesar, in the time of Augustus, in the time of Christ. And now he was gone, and he had not named a successor. He had a pregnant wife and a half-brother of diminished mental capacity. He had a collection of generals who had been competing with each other for his favour for over a decade. He had an empire that had been held together by his personality, his authority, and his physical presence, and none of those things could survive his death. His body lay in Babylon while his generals argued. Eventually it was placed in a golden coffin and taken, after considerable dispute, to Egypt, where it was installed in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. Julius Caesar, as a young man, visited the tomb and reportedly wept, because Alexander had already conquered the world at an age when Caesar had accomplished nothing. Augustus visited the tomb and was asked whether he wished to see the body of one of the Ptolemaic kings who were buried nearby. He said he had come to see a king, not dead men. The tomb was eventually lost. Its location is unknown. Archaeologists have been looking for it for 2 centuries without success. The greatest conqueror in history lies somewhere in Alexandria waiting to be found. His generals, who became known as the Diadochi, the successors, spent the next 40 years tearing each other apart in a series of wars that dismembered everything Alexander had built. His son Alexander IV was murdered at 13. His half-brother Philip III was murdered. Olympius was killed. Roxana was killed. By the end of the Wars of Succession, the empire was divided among several kingdoms, roughly the domains of his strongest generals. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took most of the Eastern Empire. Antigonus and his son Demetrius fought over Greece and Asia Minor. Cassander controlled Macedonia. The wars of the Diadochi were so devastating that in some ways they undid decades of Alexander's organizational work, but the cultural transformation he had set in motion could not be undone, because Alexander had not just conquered territory, he had spread something, the legacy, what Alexander made and what he unmade. In the decades and centuries after Alexander's death, the world he had passed through was a different world than the one that had existed before him, not only politically, not only militarily, but culturally, intellectually, and linguistically. The transformation was so profound and so lasting that historians have given it a name, the Hellenistic Age, the age of the Greek-influenced world, stretching from roughly the death of Alexander in 323 to the Roman conquest of Egypt in 31 before the Common Era. 300 years in which the culture of the Greek-speaking world dominated the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, and reached as far east as India and Afghanistan. Let us start with language, because language is where the deepest transformations live. Before Alexander, the Greek world was a collection of dialects, each city-state with its own version of the language, mutually intelligible but distinct. After Alexander, and through his successors and their kingdoms, a standardized form of Greek, Koine Greek, the common tongue, became the language of commerce, administration, literature, and intellectual life across an enormous swathe of the world. It was the language in which the Christian New Testament would eventually be written. It was the language in which the Jewish scriptures were translated for Greek-speaking Jews who had forgotten Hebrew. It was the language in which Euclid wrote his mathematics and Archimedes his physics, and the scholars of Alexandria catalogued every book in the world. Alexander did not set out to spread the Greek language in the way that later empires sometimes consciously spread their tongues. He founded Greek-style cities, settled them with Greek and Macedonian soldiers who inevitably traded and intermarried with the local populations, built Greek temples and theatres and gymnasiums and markets, and the cultural gravity of these cities pulled the surrounding regions toward the Greek cultural sphere. It was an unplanned revolution that he set in motion, and it lasted for centuries. The cities themselves were another part of the legacy. Alexandria in Egypt, which we have already discussed, was only the most famous. There were Alexandrias in the Caucasus and Bactria and on the Indus. There was a city called Alexandria Eshate, Alexandria the farthest in what is now Tajikistan. Scholars and soldiers and merchants moved between these cities, and they carried ideas with them. Ideas about philosophy, medicine, architecture, art, astronomy, and every other field that Greek culture had been developing for the previous 3 centuries. The exchange was not one-directional. The Greeks encountered Egyptian astronomy and Persian mathematics and Indian philosophy, and Babylonian astronomical records. The synthesis that resulted was the most intellectually productive period the ancient world had ever seen. The Library of Alexandria, the museum, the research institutions established by the Ptolemies in Egypt, brought scholars together from across the known world and gave them the resources to think. What they produced changed the history of science. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century before the Common Era, using the shadow of a stick in 2 different places at the same time on the same day. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth moved around the Sun, 17 centuries before Copernicus proposed the same thing. Hero of Alexandria built a working steam engine, though only as a novelty rather than as a practical device. In medicine, Herophilus performed systematic dissections of human bodies, and described the nervous system with a precision that was not improved upon for more than 1,000 years. All of this happened in the world that Alexander's conquest made possible. The movement of people, the mixing of intellectual traditions, the creation of wealthy cosmopolitan cities with the resources to support research and scholarship. Alexander did not build the Library of Alexandria. That was Ptolemy's achievement. But without Alexander, there is no Ptolemaic Egypt, and without Ptolemaic Egypt there is no Library of Alexandria. His military innovations were studied and imitated by every subsequent commander who aspired to greatness. The Macedonian combined arms system, the coordination of heavy cavalry and pike phalanx and light troops and siege engineers into a single flexible force, was the template from which Roman military tactics evolved. Julius Caesar studied Alexander. Augustus studied Alexander. Napoleon studied Alexander. Countless military colleges across the world have included his campaigns in their curricula. The Battle of Gaugamela is still analysed in military theory as an example of how to achieve decisive victory against a numerically superior force. The question of what Alexander intended, what kind of world he was trying to build, is one that has fascinated historians for 2,000 years and is still debated today. There is a vision sometimes attributed to him, preserved in the ancient sources, of a world in which all peoples were united under a single rule, in which Greek and Persian and Indian could live together, in which the barriers between conquered and conqueror could eventually dissolve. The great banquet of reconciliation at Opis, where Alexander prayed for harmony and partnership between Macedonians and Persians, is sometimes cited as evidence of this vision. But Alexander was also a man who killed his friends, who burned great cities, who required absolute obedience, who punished resistance with a ferocity that left smoking ruins across the map of Asia. The idealist and the destroyer were not two different people, they were the same person, and sorting out which was the real Alexander and which was the performance or the lapse or the pressure of circumstance is exactly the kind of question that does not have a clean answer. What the ancient world decided over time was that he was simply a different category of human being, a standard that could be referenced but not repeated. Every subsequent empire builder in the ancient and medieval world, from the Roman emperors to the Parthian kings to the Mughal rulers of India, measured themselves against Alexander and found the measurement either humbling or inspiring depending on their temperament. His name in various forms appears in the historical records of cultures he never personally encountered. Al-Iskandar in Arabic and Persian tradition, Sikander in the languages of South Asia, the great Alexander of medieval European romance. He became a figure of legend even in cultures that knew him only as a distant rumour carried along trade routes. There is a story told about Alexander that may be apocryphal, but that has circulated in various forms since antiquity. He supposedly visited a philosopher, possibly Diogenes again, possibly someone else, and asked what he wanted. The philosopher asked only to be left in peace. Alexander said that if he were not Alexander, he would want to be that philosopher. The story, whether true or not, captures something about Alexander that the record of conquest alone does not. He knew what peace was. He knew what the philosopher's contentment was. He simply could not choose it, could not stop. The wanting was too deep, the need for the next horizon too strong, the fear of standing still too immediate. He conquered the known world and still could not rest. That might be the most human thing about him. What came after? The Hellenistic world and the long echo. The world that Alexander left behind took a very long time to digest what had happened to it. His immediate successors, the Diadochi, were brilliant and ruthless men who had learned at his feet, and who immediately put everything they had learned to work against each other. The wars of succession lasted more than 4 decades. They were fought across every territory that Alexander had conquered, and the casualties were enormous. Entire armies were destroyed. Cities that had just begun to recover from Alexander's campaigns were besieged and sacked again. The grand unified empire that Alexander had spent 12 years building was dismembered with a speed that would have horrified him. But even as the political structure fell apart, the cultural changes held. The Greek-speaking kingdoms that emerged from the succession wars, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire across most of the eastern territories, the kingdom of Macedon under the Antigonids, the Attalid kingdom in Pergamon, all maintained the Greek cultural orientation that Alexander had established. Greek remained the administrative language. Greek architecture filled the new cities. Greek philosophy dominated intellectual life. The Ptolemies in Egypt were perhaps the most successful of the Diadochic kingdoms in terms of longevity and cultural productivity. They ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, from the death of Alexander to the death of Cleopatra VII in 31 before the Common Era. That Cleopatra, the famous one, the one who allied with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, a Macedonian Greek dynasty that had governed Egypt for so long that it was thoroughly Egyptian by the end. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler who actually spoke Egyptian, which gives you some sense of how completely Greek the royal family had remained for 2.5 centuries. The Seleucid Empire, which controlled the bulk of the former Persian territories, faced the most complex governance challenge. It was simply too large to hold together without the kind of personal authority that Alexander had provided, and it fragmented over time, with the eastern territories breaking away first. The Bactrian Greek kingdoms, successors in the territories that Alexander had fought so hard to subdue, lasted longest in the east, and their coins, with their extraordinary portrait realism, are among the most beautiful artifacts of the ancient world. Some Bactrian Greek kings apparently converted to Buddhism, the most extraordinary cultural synthesis that the Hellenistic age produced. The Parthians eventually replaced the Seleucids in the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, and later still the Sasanian Persians replaced the Parthians. But even these empires, which were deliberately non-Greek in their cultural orientation, retained elements of the Hellenistic synthesis. Greek coins inspired Parthian coinage. Greek architectural elements appeared in Parthian palaces. The cultural mixing that Alexander had initiated proved remarkably persistent, even when the explicitly Greek-oriented kingdoms were gone. In the West, the rising power of Rome was watching all of this with interest. The Romans were deeply influenced by Greek culture, and through Greek culture by the achievements and the model that Alexander represented. Roman generals adopted Macedonian tactics and adapted them. Roman architects borrowed Greek design and amplified it. Roman writers absorbed Greek literature and made it the foundation of their own. The Roman Empire, when it arrived, was in many ways the heir to the Hellenistic world that Alexander had created, even though the Romans spoke Latin and not Greek, and conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms one by one. Julius Caesar, who wept at Alexander's statue, died at 45 and had never commanded anything like Alexander's domain. He was perhaps the most self-consciously Alexandrian of the Roman commanders, deliberately modelling his campaigns and his ambitions on the Macedonian. Augustus, who had visited the tomb in Alexandria, went rather further than Caesar in terms of actual achievement, and built an empire that dwarfed anything Alexander had ruled. But Augustus was also careful, methodical, and extremely long-lived. He was, in his way, the anti-Alexander. He lived to 76 and died in his bed. The figure of Alexander echoed through the medieval world as well. In the Islamic tradition, he appears as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a figure in the Quran who travels to the ends of the earth and builds a great wall against the forces of Gog and Magog. The identification of this figure with Alexander is not universal among scholars, but the tradition of Alexander as a near-mythological world conqueror penetrated deeply into Arabic and Persian culture. The Alexander Romance, a legendary account of his life that bears very little resemblance to historical reality and a great deal of resemblance to fairy tale, circulated in dozens of languages and was enormously popular throughout the medieval world. It was translated into Arabic, Persian, Syriac, Ethiopic, Armenian, and multiple European languages. In these versions, Alexander flies through the air on the backs of griffins, descends to the bottom of the sea in a glass diving bell, and searches for the water of life in the land of darkness. He is a hero of legend as much as a king of history. Napoleon studied his battles. Napoleon is probably the European commander most consciously shaped by Alexander's example, both in his strategic style, the speed, the decisive engagement, the personal leadership from the front, and in his self-presentation as a world historical figure. After his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon is said to have remarked that the greatest of all conquerors had died at 32, without any disasters, and that he himself had lived too long. Whether or not he said exactly this, the sentiment reflects how deeply the Alexandrian model had penetrated the European military and political imagination. In academic and popular culture, the fascination with Alexander has never ended. He has been the subject of more biographies than perhaps any other figure from the ancient world except Julius Caesar. Films, novels, plays, video games, and countless other forms have retold his story, always finding something new to emphasize, always projecting onto him the concerns and questions of their own era. He has been a symbol of Western imperialism. He has been a symbol of cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism. He has been a symbol of tragic overreach. He has been a symbol of what human ambition at its purest can achieve. He contains, as a historical figure, enough complexity and enough genuine contradiction that almost any interpretation can find something in the record to support it. The question of what to make of Alexander is ultimately a question about what we value. If we value human life and the absence of suffering, His campaign was a catastrophe for hundreds of thousands of people who died in battles, sieges, and punitive expeditions that had not been their choice. If we value cultural exchange and the acceleration of human knowledge, his campaign created the conditions for some of the most productive centuries of intellectual history the ancient world experienced. If we value personal achievement and the pushing of human limits, his 12 years of campaigning represent something almost beyond evaluation. If we value good governance and the well-being of ordinary people, his record is deeply uneven. He was not simply a hero. He was not simply a villain. He was a human being of extraordinary capability who operated at the extreme edge of what humans can do, and who paid for that extremity personally and asked others to pay for it as well, sometimes with everything they had. The cities he founded are mostly gone, or buried beneath later settlements, or known only as names in ancient texts. The empire dissolved within a generation. The tomb is lost. The horse is dust. The friends who marched beside him are dust. And yet here we are, 2,340-something years after his death, still talking about him in the middle of the night. That perhaps is the measure of what he did. He wanted to be remembered. He arranged his life with that intention from the very beginning, from the visit to Troy and the thrown spear and the adoption of Achilles as his model. He wanted what Achilles had chosen, the short, brilliant life, the eternal fame. He got it. At whatever cost, he got it. The night carries him east. There is something about Alexander's story that resists the usual endings. Other great figures of history have tidy conclusions. They win their wars and govern peacefully and die old, or they are defeated and deposed, and the world moves on. Alexander's story ends in the middle. 32 years old, still planning, still building, still reaching toward the next horizon that had not yet revealed itself. The Arabian expedition was 3 weeks from departure when he fell ill. He never sailed it. We do not know what he would have found. The not knowing is part of what makes him haunt us. Every other conqueror eventually stopped, whether by choice or by circumstance or by death in old age. Alexander stopped because a fever stopped him. The story has no conclusion that feels adequate, and perhaps that is appropriate, because the ambition that drove him had no natural conclusion either. He crossed the Hellespont at 21 with 32,000 soldiers and a copy of the Iliad. He died at 32, having conquered an area larger than anything that had been conquered before. In between those 2 points, he crossed mountains and deserts and rivers. He faced armies 10 times the size of his own and found the gap in their lines. He built cities and burned cities and named horses and wrote letters home and killed his friends and grieved them and kept moving. He kept moving. That is, I think, the most essential thing about him. Not the victories, which were extraordinary, not the losses, which were real, but the movement, the refusal to stop, the absolute certainty from his earliest years to his last campaigns that there was always something further east, always another river to cross, always a horizon that moved as you approached it. In the end, the horizon did not move. He was 32, and the fever came, and the ring went to Perdiccas, and the generals who had followed him across the world looked at each other over his cooling body and began to calculate what each of them might take. But for those 12 years, those 12 extraordinary years, the world had not seen anything like it before, and it has not seen anything quite like it since. Tonight we have followed a boy born to thunder, educated by the greatest mind in the ancient world, thrust into kingship at 20, and across the deserts and mountains and rivers of Asia at a pace that left the known world barely time to understand what was happening to it. We have stood at the Hellespont as a spear was thrown into Asian soil. We have looked across the battlefield of Gaugamela as an empire 3,000 years old dissolved in an afternoon. We have felt the cold of the Hindu Kush, and the heat of the Gadrosian desert, and the weight of a friendship lost at Maracanda. We have watched a man who wanted everything discover that wanting everything is both the source of extraordinary achievement and the cost of almost everything else. Now the distances are quiet. The armies are still. The cities Alexander built stand in the dark of history, their stones worn smooth by 2 millennia of wind and rain, and the feet of people who mostly do not know who built them. Let the story settle, the way all stories settle when the night is quiet. Let the weight of it distribute evenly. The victories and the losses, the brilliance and the brutality, the extraordinary human being who was born in Macedonia in 356 before the Common Era and died in Babylon in 323, and in between did things that we are still making sense of. Your breathing is easy now. The campaign is over. The great march east has ended at the river, The altars built, the army turning home through the warm air of the Punjab, the fleet is somewhere on the Indian Ocean, finding the route between worlds. The cities are being built one after another, carrying the name of their founder into languages and centuries he never imagined, and somewhere in Alexandria, in a tomb we cannot find, the greatest conqueror in history sleeps the long sleep of the genuinely done, genuinely exhausted, finally at rest. Let the image settle. The marble city by the sea. The lighthouse at the harbour entrance, visible for miles across the water. The library full of every book ever written. The scholars working by lamplight on mathematics and medicine, and the measurement of the earth. All of it growing from the decisions of one restless, extraordinary, deeply human young man who could not stop moving. Now you can stop. Now the horizon can wait. Now the night is all there is, and it is enough. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are listening from tonight. The long march is over. The king has come home.